frame this conversation to my students, I never say old school, I never say basic, I never say beginner, I never say fundamental. I say statistically common moves. What are the statistically common moves? What is actually happening in the fight versus the Instagram highlight? They're very different things. And I think Carlson had an approach that was perhaps less sophisticated, but something that would be more applicable to MMA versus something applicable in sport jiu-jitsu format. And I think these lines then weren't that clearly drawn, but as the diversification process takes place, they become more and more obvious. So much so that, you know, today there's a big gap between competitive jiu-jitsu and a jiu-jitsu for MMA. They're very different today. But then the lines were not that well drawn, if that makes any sense. It was an early stage of the diversification.
You mentioned how Carlson students were really dominant. They were dominant in jiu-jitsu competitions. I know in the 90s they were very dominant. A lot of his athletes won a lot of gold medals. Can you talk about the style of his athletes and just give context about that team and how they dominated the jiu-jitsu scene?
Carlson hated to lose, from all accounts. And I am no authority here because I met him once when I was like 17. I took a picture with him. I remember what I told him. I walked up to him and I said, "You're my favorite Gracie." And he was really happy when I said that. And I said that because to me, the best MMA fighters in the world were Carlson students. So that's why he was. I didn't know anything about him other than that. Your students to me are the best guys in the world. You know, I love Murilo Bustamante, Carlon Barreto, I love Vitor Belfort. Like, those were my heroes when I was 16, 17. And I rooted for them. Every time they lost, I'd be so upset. I'm like, it can't happen, you know? These guys are supposed to win all the time. So I really admired Carlson. So I don't know anything of Carlson beyond, you know, that brief experience. But from all accounts, he was a fiercely competitive individual. But it was a kind of competition that I think competition gets a bad rep because it almost sounds like you're a bad person or you're trying to like put people down. And we have this ethos of equality in the world in 2024 where like everything was supposed to be equal. And I disagree with that. I think that you should be striving to outdo the person next to you so long as you're ethical about it. I think ambition can be ethical. I don't think every form of ambition needs to be deceitful or unethical, right? And Carlson, from all accounts, was a very down-to-earth guy. Like, he was a warrior on the mats. He was a brute on the mats. That's how someone describes him as a coach and as a fighter. But he was a very, like, almost like a child off the mats. He was a very kind, loving. He would take his watch off and give it to people. If someone complimented the watch, he would take his shoes off and give it to someone. He was a very giving individual. Most of his students trained for free. Like, everything he did was for the growth of jiu-jitsu, and I admire that because I think this is the kind of trooper you want in your corner, man. This is the kind of people you can say, this is a real trooper for jiu-jitsu because where his priorities lie are become very obvious by his attitude. Like, it's not that there's nothing wrong with making money. That's not what I'm saying, but it was very clear to me, at least, that Carlson was in love with competition and with the growth of jiu-jitsu for jiu-jitsu's own sake, not necessarily because he wanted to do what was best for him. In fact, if you watch his life closely, I think he was often hurting himself individually, right? Because he was so committed to growing jiu-jitsu through his students and a competitive approach to jiu-jitsu. I think that's the kind of healthy kind of competition we should aspire to look for, right? And there's an interesting story. There was a jiu-jitsu event. I can't remember the year now. I want to say 91, where the Luta Livre guys. Luta Livre they were the jiu-jitsu rivals at the time, and they storm a jiu-jitsu event. They want to fight, you know, they're there to brawl, and they have guns on them. And, you know, everyone's scared, and there's like a big situation. The only guy they would talk to is Carlson, the Luta Livre guys with guns. The only guy they would talk to, because it's the only guy that everyone respected. And Carlson brings him in a room. You guys want to fight? Let's fight, but we're going to do it in a ring. We're not going to fight here. No guns. Take your guns home. We're going to fight in the ring. Let's put it to the test. And that's when the MMA, the Vale Tudo, 91 Vale Tudo, took place in Brazil, which was like, it was almost like a little push for the UFC. I think that's a neglected aspect of this story too, is that's what got that whole generation of people going, man, we can do this. This MMA thing is a great way of selling jiu-jitsu. I think that's what got Rorion's mind going, because Rorion had been, you guys may or may not know this, Rorion had been in the United States since the late 70s. And it was all about Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and self-defense. And he wasn't, nothing to do with MMA. He was trying to get into Hollywood. He was trying different routes. And they weren't working that well. The second he gets the UFC off the ground, boom, it starts working. So I think the 91 event between Luta Livre and Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil was no doubt a factor in giving Rorion the incentive to create the UFC. But I think going back to Carlson, I think that goes to show what kind of person he was. It's the guys that the Luta Livre guys would respect. Despite the fact that they hated Jiu-Jitsu, everyone respected Carlson.
Can you talk a little bit more about Holes, his personality and his contributions to Jiu-Jitsu? Because unfortunately he passed away at a young age, but he was still a reference for a lot of coaches and competitors. People still talk about him to this day. So if you could give a little more context about Holes, that'd be amazing.
Holes died young. He died young. He was in his prime when he died, and from all accounts, he was a very charismatic individual, very gifted. The Gracie family always has this thing where there was a number one in the family, right? And first it was George, and it was Helio, then it was Carlson, and then it was Hollis, and then it was Hickson. They always had that, like, who's the number one in the family? And there was a huge generation of, a lot of males within, like, Hollis's age group. So he had a lot of competition to see who was going to be the alpha of the family, and he came out on top. I think his move to the Figueiredo de Magalhães Academy, that's where Carlson taught. I think his move there had a huge impact on his own jiu-jitsu, because he became, like, I think he realized this is how we need to train if you want to win tournaments. Like, we have to train more competitively. Very charismatic guy. He brings a surf aspect to jiu-jitsu that I don't think people fully appreciate. I was interviewing Vinicius Draculino on Thursday. I had like a 1-hour chat with him. The conversation will be, it's either in another book I'm working on or will be in the second edition of the second book, right? But he was like, man, you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned the surf culture, but I don't think you went deep enough with it, because, you know, the surfers in Brazil, they were not like, oh, aloha, I mean, not the aloha kai, but like the hippie type, you know, where you're just like, oh, just chill, you know. No, these guys were brawlers. There was like, if you come close to my wave, there was a fight on the beach every time. So it was a very warrior-like culture in surf. And he was describing, that's in fact how Draculino got into jiu-jitsu, because he kept seeing the Gracies win fights on the beach all the time. It's like, I want to do what they're doing. And but the surf culture was something that Hollis, which was a younger generation, like his students were within that scene of, I think you have to, like, this is the Figueiredo Academy, by the way. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this academy in a second. But I think Hollis was very important that he brought in he was a big part in bringing a different kind of culture into jiu-jitsu. You have to remember, Brazil from 64 to 85 was under military dictatorship, right? So this was a harsh military government, curfew, no tolerance for free press, you know, no freedom of speech, no political parties. Like, it was a very rough kind of environment that people, you know, especially the youth in the 60s and 70s and early 80s were rebelling against, right? These guys wanted to smoke weed, they liked rock and roll, they wanted the hair to grow long, they had a very different approach, a less conservative approach to life, right? So, you know, anyone that's older here and grew up in the United States in the 60s and 70s can relate. It was that generation, like, we're going to do things different from our parents. And I think Hollis brings this aspect of surf culture, açaí, the açaí after practice. That's something that started with these guys, you know, in Brazil. Açaí was not a common fruit in Brazil before these guys, just so you know. Like, most Brazilians had never heard of açaí. I had never heard of açaí before jiu-jitsu. So he helps bring this, the surfers into jiu-jitsu, and they were bringing with them that warrior ethos. Like, we're not just here for education, we're here to learn how to fight, because it was the streets of the South Zone of Rio were a very competitive environment. You went out, you had to be ready. It wasn't just going out to have fun. There's a chance the ball was going to break out. And this happened on many, I mean, there's stories about this that go on and on and on. We don't have to get into it, but jiu-jitsu evolved with this as a background, which is not a jiu-jitsu problem. It was a real problem at the time. The jiu-jitsu faction just happened to be one of the factions. There were other capoeiras, the luta livre guys, the surfers themselves. So there were many factions with a very fiercely competitive environment. And I think jiu-jitsu was the one that attracted people the most, right? It was, my opinion, the most efficient one too. So I think that background is important as well in the evolution of jiu-jitsu. But going back to Hollis, I think his charisma, especially his technical ability, from all accounts, he was a very, very gifted guy. He was the most dominant guy in his prime before he passed. I think it's fair to say he was the best grappler in Brazil at the time. in an open mind. I think a lot of people don't know this, but he was, not the first one, but one of the first ones to seek out to learn wrestling and judo. He sought out other ways of practicing, like adding things to jiu-jitsu, concerned with the evolution, and perhaps open-minded enough to be aware of the potential evolutionary outlets for jiu-jitsu that weren't clear at the time. But I think he saw potential. I think that we can do better. Instead of just going, because when you see things as they are, you think they can never be different. They are the way they are. How could it ever be different? This is what it is, right? And then it takes a guy like him to go, no, we can improve on this. We can make it better. The old ways are not necessarily the best ways. And I think Holz was that guy that had perhaps a more modern approach to jiu-jitsu. It wouldn't be wrong to place him as a precursor to a more competitive / sophisticated approach to jiu-jitsu, whereas Carlson was more of a let's get this to work in a fight, because that's what really matters. Again, early process of diversification, not so clear at the time, but I think it's clearer now.
You brought up the Figueiredo Academy. I was hoping you could dive a little bit deeper into that, talk about its relevance and why it was so important to the evolution of jiu-jitsu.
I'm sorry, say that again?
The Figueiredo Academy, if you could talk a little bit more about that.
So the Figueiredo Academy was a building. I feel it's in Copacabana in Rio de Janeiro. I've never been, but I plan on going this year to visit. I have to go in there and just touch the walls of that historical building, because the version of jiu-jitsu we practice, as I argue, it has a genealogy. It traces itself back to the original Gracie Academy, back to judo. There's no one can deny that. Anyone tells you that these guys are practicing pre-Meiji, pre-judo jiu-jitsu, it's not true. It was a variant of judo, especially pre-war judo, which was closer to a 50-50 distribution between takedowns and ground fighting. It was closer to 50-50. Post-war judo was more stand-up oriented. But the Figueiredo Academy, to me, marks a second process of transformation in jiu-jitsu, right? The first is when Carlson and Helios say, no, we're not doing this, we're going to do that. It's going to be doing different, we're going to do it better, and we're going to create a new hierarchy outside of the Kodokan. But I think a second movement takes place inside the Figueiredo Academy, where these two guys, they have a different approach to jiu-jitsu. Again, they're using the same word, but it's something we have to acknowledge. We can't ignore this. It's fundamentally different. And the Figueiredo Academy was a place for the youth to get together. So from all accounts, these guys would be out there midnight. It was a place for the youth to be. It was a place where they could be free to be themselves, away from their conservative parents. It had the beach culture. They're all surfers. They were the guys who liked the beach soccer, acai, flip-flops, hang loose, give everyone a hug after practice. It was not formal. So going back to that topic about the culture of jiu-jitsu being so surf-oriented and so, I want to say friendly, it's very, I have very little experience in other martial arts outside of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but I hear this a lot. You hear a lot of judokas say this. I was watching an interview with Flavio Canto. He's a very successful judoka in Brazil. He was talking about why he thinks Brazilian jiu-jitsu is growing so fast and probably will outdo judo one day, if it hasn't already. And he's mentioning the lifestyle, the culture. Whereas in judo, it's like if you're not at the Olympics, or if you're not going to the Olympics, what are you doing? It's the same thing in wrestling. There's no outlet for wrestlers and judokas other than the Olympics or being a coach at a university, which is not an easy job to land. Whereas for us, there are different outlets for us to continue here. This fact that this Masters events, this Masters Worlds, is the largest jiu-jitsu event in the world is very symbolic. I think it is descriptive of what I'm saying. There is longevity in jiu-jitsu, whereas in other competitive sports like judo, it's not something you can sell to the public because, man, it's hard. In jiu-jitsu, it can be hard, but it can also be easier. How do I know this? Because I got arthritis. It sucks. I'm 42, man. I'm not, but it hurts. So I'm like, okay, how do I train now without hurting myself? And I was talking to Master Carlos Gracie Jr. when I interviewed him for the second book. And he was telling me that he trains 4 times a week. And I think he's 67. I'm like, how do you do that? I have no idea how he does that. But if he does that, I can do it. And I'm watching, he watches his diet. He has a very healthy lifestyle. He tries to work out a little bit every day. I'm like, okay, that's what I got to do. But I can do that in jiu-jitsu. It's hard to do that if you wrestle, you know what I'm talking about. It's very hard to do that in wrestling. right? And I think more than that, more importantly to the point of the Figueiredo Academy, is the culture they develop there. The culture that grew out of the Figueiredo Academy is the culture that is a fundamental aspect of the growth of jiu-jitsu around the world. I am convinced. To me, it's not the technique. The techniques are great. I love the technique. I like the competitive aspect. But the techniques exist in catch wrestling. They exist in Kosen Judo. They exist in Sambo. They're not that different. To me, the determining factor was what Kanto referred to as the lifestyle. The chill, the acai, the friend, the hug, like that. It's a very different kind of vibe that I don't think, again, I'm not the most qualified person to comment on this, but I think that other martial arts are perhaps missing, and that's something that we have in abundance. I can go to any gym, jiu-jitsu gym in the world, and I will be immediately welcome, and that applies not just to me, it applies to all of you guys. You're a brother the second you walk in. There's no hostility, and I think it's a very welcoming environment. I was talking to, he doesn't want me to mention his name, so I won't, okay, but he's large part the brain behind this operation here, to a large extent, and he was referring to jiu-jitsu as the third place. He wanted it to be the third place. The first place is home. You got to go home. You don't have a choice. Second place is work. You got to go to work. If you're a child, it's school. You got to go to school. You don't have a choice. The third place is where you choose to be. It's the only place you choose to be, and you're there because you want to be there. It's a place that's important to you. You go there, it makes you happy. This is my break. This is where I see my friends. This is where I laugh. This is where I get my endorphins. This is where I get a happy workout, and I go home with a smile on my face. Sometimes you go home, you may not have a smile on your face if you don't do jiu-jitsu. You go to school, maybe you don't like school. You know, sometimes you hate your job. But the jiu-jitsu gym, if you don't like, you can do something else. You don't have to be there. But the fact that you keep coming back to beat yourself up, I think says something about the environment. And again, as much as I love the techniques, and I do love the techniques, I don't think that is the distinguishing factor. I think that the distinguishing factor is the culture we created around jiu-jitsu.
Carlson and Holes contributed so many different things to jiu-jitsu, but if you had to boil it down to their most important contributions individually, what would you say was Carlson's and Holes' most important contributions to the sport?
I think Carlson got the ball kick-started. I think it was his movement. And I think Helio had a very important role in all this. I am not neglecting what Helio did and the importance he had. He was the general that jiu-jitsu needed during a time where jiu-jitsu was at risk of being absorbed by judo and the troops of dispersing into judo itself, surf, or something else. He kept these guys in line. This is what we're doing. This is where we're going. But I think as he aged, perhaps he was no longer the right guy to democratize it. You understand? Like he had a different approach. Like it was more, again, self-defense oriented, wealthier individuals, private lessons. Carlson was like, I don't care how much money you make. I don't care what your skin color is. I don't care if you're poor, if you're rich, if you're a man, woman. As long as you meet the standards, and you can survive the jungle, you are welcome to my school. That was his approach, which is my approach. I believe that. I never believed in treating women differently. Like, all women got to be treated differently. No, they don't. Treat them exactly the same. I treat my kids, I put my teens in my class. I treat them like adults. You either meet the standard or you can go back to the kids' class. And I think that's the approach we should have. It's a very meritocratic environment, and I admire that. And Carlson had that. He was the guy who was like, you want to survive in here, you're more than welcome, but this is where the bar is. And I think he was the guy that had the vision to get jiu-jitsu kick-started and push it in that competitive direction. And I think Hollis was the rival. Like, it's what there's a chapter in my second book called The Brotherly Rivalry, because it was the healthy kind of competition that I admire. It's the kind of competition I want to have with you. As long as you're pushing me to be better, bring it. I love it. It's never the destructive kind, right? And Hollis was the ideal rival. And again, let's take a moment here to acknowledge the fact that these guys shared a building, alternating days, and we're not at war with each other over students. I think that's an incredible feat of maturity and love and commitment for jiu-jitsu, because I think that's what kept it together. We're doing something with a purpose. And I truly believe that was something that Carlos and Helio instilled in their children. We're doing this, we're doing it different, we're going somewhere. And they had that in their head. It was like a military upbringing, and they were raised with that. Every day, that thing in their head, we're doing jiu-jitsu, we're doing it differently, this is where we're going. And I think these guys had that commitment to grow jiu-jitsu in their own way. And Holmes, I mean, additionally to that, we also have, I think he had a big role in bringing the surf culture into jiu-jitsu. Carlson was not a surfer.
Awesome. Well, Robert, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. I know you've done a ton of research into this topic, and it's been amazing for you to share your knowledge with everyone. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Danny. It was a pleasure. I just want to say one last thing before I go. And I mean this when I say this. People who know me, I'm not one to blow, smoke up people's butts. I don't play politics. I mean things. When I say them, I'm more concerned with them being truthful than I am about them advancing me or politically or anything. I admire what these guys have done, because I don't think people fully appreciate what jiu-jitsu was before. Like, I started in '98, which is fairly late compared to some people. And I started in '98, and whenever I went to a tournament, there was a chance that a brawl was going to break out. And people are like, no, that doesn't happen. No, it happened a lot. I've seen it. I've seen it at the high level. I've seen it at the World Championships. It was a very hostile environment. It was very unorganized. When people complain about refereeing today, I'm like, you have no idea what you're talking about. This is light years ahead in terms of organization. I have an opening quote in one of the chapters of the book where it goes, "Ordem é progresso." That's what my fifth grade teacher would always tell me whenever we were like, being kids, and she would always say that, and it kind of stuck with me, because the Brazilian flag glows ordem e progresso, which means order and progress. But she would always say ordem é progresso, which means order is progress. And I love that about jiu-jitsu, because I think without order, there is no progress. Like, the organization of jiu-jitsu is something that was fundamental for the growth. And I think that we need to acknowledge that without this level of organization, we will not be here. I make a comfortable living from jiu-jitsu, perhaps more than I need, perhaps more than I deserve, because of people that did something before me. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. And without that effort that goes way far back, it didn't start yesterday. It didn't even start with hoists. It started way before that. There's a genealogy here that we need to acknowledge, that we do something awesome because these people were dedicated themselves to the same thing we're doing now when there was free of reward. They were doing it straight out of love, straight from the heart. There was no money to be made, no fame to be had. You are not going to get Instagram followers. It was a very different world, but the commitment was a very truthful one. So I think we should all acknowledge and respect this history and how we got here and why, and who were the precursors and who are the people who gave their hearts and soul to jiu-jitsu for us to be here today.
Awesome. Thank you again, Robert. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I can take the mics. Thank you again. That was awesome.